He was a millionaire CEO, powerful, untouchable, always in control. She was his new secretary, quiet, invisible, and just trying to survive. When he humiliated her in front of an entire boardroom, everyone expected her to break, but she didn't. What happens when a man who's forgotten how to feel is faced with a woman who refuses to disappear? How does kindness return to someone who buried it long ago? This isn't a love story. It's a story about presence, about dignity, about finding the strength to stand tall when the world expects you to shrink. 12 chapters. One handwritten letter from a child, and a silence. That changed everything. Why did she smile after being broken in front of her coworkers? What did he see in her that he couldn't see in himself? And how did one quiet woman leave a powerful man? Utterly speechless. Hit like, share this story if it touches your heart, and don't forget to subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, let's begin. She had only been on the job for 3 weeks when he humiliated her in front of the entire team. And yet, she didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't quit. It was a Wednesday morning at Winters & Harrow Consulting, and the sky outside the glass-paneled conference room was the color of cold metal. The first frost of the season had painted the world in silver. Cars outside wore a film of white, and the air smelled faintly of chimney smoke, quiet warnings that winter was coming. Claire Bennett sat at the far end of the table, her pen poised over her notepad like a violin bow waiting for the cue. She always came in early, often before the sun had fully stretched over the hills outside the town. By the time the office lights flickered on, her desk was already tidy, her coffee lukewarm, her breath steady. She was 36, a single mother, the kind of woman who packed apple slices in her daughter's lunchbox with a note that said, "Shine today." The kind of woman who used her lunch break to call her mother's doctor, to check medication schedules, to plan how to stretch each paycheck to the next without letting the seams of her world come undone. Claire had taken the job as personal secretary to Nathaniel Harrow, co-founder and CEO of one of the most reputable consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest. Everyone in town knew his name, partly because it was on the building, and partly because no one ever saw him smile. Nathaniel was 44, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, always in navy or charcoal, as if color might betray something he wasn't ready to show. He rarely spoke in meetings unless he had to, and when he did, people listened like children at church, quietly, reverently, and always slightly afraid. His mother, Meredith Harrow, had built the company from a one-room office in Portland and raised Nathaniel like a soldier, not a son. When she passed 2 years ago, he took over entirely. And though the firm grew under his hand, warmth didn't. Claire had been warned before taking the position. He's particular, the HR manager had said with a tight smile, as if warning her about a storm that hadn't hit yet. Claire had simply nodded. She needed the job. That was all that mattered. That morning's meeting was meant to finalize a consulting contract with a key client. Claire had prepared the draft herself, cross-checking the numbers, formatting the appendices, making sure the wording was precise, but the template software had glitched, duplicating a clause in 2 separate paragraphs. She hadn't noticed. Nathaniel did. He didn't raise his voice. That would have almost been better. He simply stopped mid-sentence, held up the document, and asked, "Can someone tell me why we are offering the same condition twice?" The room went still. Claire looked up, blinking. Her fingers tightened around her pen, but she said nothing at first. Then softly, she opened her mouth. "I believe the system, Miss Bennett," he interrupted, his tone clipped. "This is a contract that reflects our competence. Sloppiness is not a luxury we can afford." Across the table, no one made eye contact. Even the senior partners avoided her gaze. Claire sat straighter, feeling the flush rise beneath her skin. But she didn't fidget, didn't let her voice shake. "I'll revise it," she said, evenly. "You'll revise it now," Nathaniel said, pushing the paper toward her with a single motion, like a judge handing down a verdict. Then, colder still, "If this happens again, you're out." Silence. Just the low hum of the heater kicking on. Claire nodded. She wrote something in the corner of her notebook, nothing meaningful, just something to keep her hands moving. The meeting continued, numbers, metrics, forecasts. But her ears rang with heat, not because of the mistake she could own that, but because he hadn't let her speak, hadn't even looked her in the eye when delivering the blow. Afterward, no one approached her. A few sympathetic glances, maybe, but mostly, people scattered like leaves in wind. She returned to her desk, opened the file, corrected the error, resent the draft. Each keystroke was controlled, measured, as if she could type her frustration into the very marrow of the machine. By 5:15, her desk was clean again, her coat buttoned. The wind outside had picked up, rustling dry leaves along the curb. She walked to the parking lot with her head held high, though every step felt like she was walking through cement. She arrived home just before 6. The porch light flickered as she climbed the stairs. Inside, the scent of chamomile and wood polish greeted her. Her mother must have lit the wax warmer again. In the living room, Emily was coloring a picture of a fox in a snowy field, her tongue peeking slightly out in concentration. "Mommy," Emily called, dropping her crayon and bounding over. Claire crouched to hug her, breathing in the scent of peanut butter and fabric softener. "Hey, Peanut, did you finish your homework?" "Mm-hmm." Emily nodded. Then, looking up with curious eyes, "Did you have a good day at work?" Claire paused. She thought about the conference room, about the way her mistake had been turned into a spectacle, about the silence that followed, the way she'd swallowed her words just to survive the moment. She looked into her daughter's face, open, bright, completely untouched by cruelty, and she smiled, soft and steady, better than yesterday. Most days, she spoke only when spoken to, and most days, he barely noticed her except when she got something wrong. Claire arrived each morning before the office had fully woken up. The lobby lights still blinked to life, one by one, and the elevator took its time, humming up from the ground floor. She wore the same pair of black flats every day, scuffed but polished, soles worn thin from years of waiting, walking, standing. Her desk, tucked outside Nathaniel Harrow's glass-walled office, was a picture of symmetry. Pens lined up neatly in a recycled mug, paper clips sorted into an old candle jar, Post-it notes stacked in order of color. There was comfort in order. Predictability kept the rest of her life from unraveling. She began each day with 2 cups of tea, 1 chamomile for herself. 1 Earl Grey left on the corner of Nathaniel's desk by 7:45. He never acknowledged it, but he never complained either. She always used the same mug for him, white porcelain with a faint crack beneath the handle. He liked the old one better than the new, though he never said why. Claire didn't need him to say it. Most mornings passed like clockwork. She typed letters, proofed spreadsheets, fielded emails with polite efficiency. She made few errors. She asked for little. She answered phones with a tone warm enough to soothe, but never familiar enough to invite conversation. At noon, she would excuse herself for 15 minutes and take the side stairwell to the parking lot, where the cell signal was stronger. She'd lean against the cold brick wall, tucking her coat tighter as she called her mother's caregiver. Is she eating okay today? Did she remember to take her pills? Is Emily settled after school? Claire never lingered on the phone longer than necessary. She wasn't the type to speak in long paragraphs. Just the essential things like folding laundry in straight lines or packing lunches with no crusts. Love, for her, was shown in small, invisible acts. Nathaniel, on the other hand, was the kind of man who seemed to absorb silence. He never filled empty space with needless chatter, never smiled just to be polite. He worked with a slow, focused intensity that made people nervous. Some called it arrogance. Claire suspected it was something else entirely, though she couldn't have said what exactly. He rarely looked up when speaking to her, except when she made a mistake. Then, his gaze was sharp, searching, not cruel, just unforgiving. But lately, something in the way he looked at her had changed. It started with a glance brief, almost accidental when she handed him the revised proposal last week. Their hands brushed, and instead of pulling away immediately, Nathaniel paused just a moment too long. Claire had ignored it, chalked it up to fatigue, But it happened again. On Tuesday. She caught him watching her through the glass partition as she answered the phone. He wasn't glaring or assessing. He was just watching, as if trying to decipher something he didn't understand. Claire didn't know what to make of it. She didn't trust it, not entirely. She'd worked for men before she knew how easily curiosity could slip into presumption. That afternoon, as she was carrying a stack of binders to the filing room, one of the senior consultants, Mark Blakely, tall, charming in a polished sort of way, offered to help. "Looks heavy. Claire," he said with an easy grin. "Let me take half." She hesitated, caught between politeness and pride. Before she could respond, Nathaniel stepped out of his office. "She's fine," he said curtly. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Just trying to help." "I said she's fine." Claire stiffened. The binders grew heavier in her arms, though nothing had changed. Mark gave a small shrug and walked away. She didn't say anything as she passed Nathaniel, didn't meet his eyes, but her hands trembled slightly when she placed the files down. She wasn't sure why. Back at her desk, she sat with her back straight, her breath shallow. She flipped open her notebook, the one she kept tucked behind her calendar. On the first page, written in neat black ink, was a line she'd copied months ago from a self-help blog she never admitted to reading. "Remember, be invisible. It's safer." She stared at it now, as if the words could shield her from whatever it was that had just shifted in the air. Nathaniel hadn't been rude, not exactly, but there had been something possessive in his tone, something unnecessary. And Claire wasn't foolish. She knew that lines, once blurred, could become traps. Later that evening, she sat alone on the edge of her bed, folding Emily's pajamas into piles. Her mother was asleep in the next room, a rhythmic creak of the rocking chair soft behind the closed door. The silence was comforting, predictable, safe. But in her mind, she replayed that moment in the hallway, Mark's offer, Nathaniel's interruption. And beneath all the worry, a question stirred. Was it possible he'd cared, or worse, had he been jealous? She shook her head and folded the last pajama shirt with extra care. No, that wasn't safe. That wasn't part of the plan. But in the days that followed, it became clear he was noticing her more, and she didn't know yet if that was a blessing or a storm on the horizon. He didn't want her to come. She didn't want to go. But life has a way of pairing the most unlikely people together, especially on stormy roads. It had been a Wednesday morning when the call came in. One of the firm's longest-standing clients, Mr. Halverson, had agreed to sign the property transition papers in person. A man well into his 80s, he refused to handle anything electronically, still believing in handshakes and the weight of real paper. Nathaniel was already scheduled to make the 2-hour drive to the small riverside town of Fern Hollow. It was meant to be routine, formal, efficient, but at 7:12 a.m., his executive assistant called in with the flu. Claire didn't ask questions when the operations manager forwarded the itinerary to her desk. She only adjusted her schedule, packed the documents into a weatherproof folder, and grabbed her coat. She had no illusion she was not wanted on this trip. Nathaniel didn't say it out loud, but the look he gave her in the parking garage was confirmation enough. Cold, tightly drawn, like a man handed the wrong tool for a delicate job. They said little during the first hour of the drive. The car, a silver Lexus with leather seats that still smelled new, hummed softly over the interstate. Nathaniel drove with the same focus he brought to board meetings, hands steady, posture perfect, expression unreadable. Claire sat beside him, folding and unfolding the strap of her purse, glancing out at the trees lining the highway. Autumn was beginning to settle in for good. The leaves had turned copper and amber, and the sky hung low, thick with gray. She wasn't nervous, not exactly, but the silence between them felt heavier than usual, like something fragile pressed under glass. When they arrived at the Halverson home, a modest brick house with a porch full of wind chimes and ceramic geese, the rain had started. Just a whisper on the wind, but Claire could smell the damp earth already. Mr. Halverson greeted them in a brown cardigan with mismatched socks. He moved slowly but spoke quickly, his voice gravelly and warm. Nathaniel stood politely, presenting the documents with clean formality. It was all going smoothly until the old man fumbled for his glasses. "I could have sworn I left them on the kitchen counter," he muttered, half to himself. Claire was already rising from her seat. "May I take a look?" He nodded, waving her off with a grateful smile. She returned a minute later, gently placing the spectacles into his waiting hands. "Found them in the bread box," she said softly. Nathaniel didn't say a word, but something shifted in the corner of his expression, just the briefest flicker of something softer. Maybe surprise, maybe guilt. The papers were signed, the rain turned harder, and halfway down the highway, they found the road blocked by a large maple tree felled by wind. Emergency crews were delayed. The GPS showed no alternate route within 50 miles. Nathaniel's jaw clenched as he stared at the blinking hazard lights ahead. Claire spoke first. "There was a little bed and breakfast a few miles back. I saw a sign." He didn't answer, just reversed the car and turned around. The bed and breakfast was an aging colonial house with crooked shutters and fading paint. The woman who ran it wore oversized glasses and smelled of lavender. She had only one room left. Nathaniel hesitated. Claire didn't. "It's fine," she said gently. "We'll manage." The room had 2 twin beds, flowered quilts, and lace curtains that fluttered despite closed windows. A small lamp on the nightstand cast a soft golden glow. Claire opened the closet for extra blankets. Most were wool. She didn't say anything when the first itch crept across her neck. She just sat down on the bed, rubbing her arms discreetly. Her skin was always sensitive to wool, something she'd inherited from her mother. Nathaniel noticed it about 10 minutes later. She had changed into a long-sleeved sweater, but her cheeks were blotchy, and her breathing had grown shallower. "You're allergic," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. "It's just mild," but he was already up, pulling open drawers, checking the linen cabinet in the hallway. When he returned, he held out a cotton blanket, thin but clean. This should be better. She accepted it silently. No thank you, no eye contact, just the weight of the gesture settling between them. Later, the rain grew heavier, rattling against the old windows. They both ended up in the small kitchen downstairs, where the innkeeper had left a kettle on the stove and mismatched mugs on a tray. Nathaniel poured the tea. Claire found sugar cubes in a jar labeled Hope. They sat at the old kitchen table, facing each other, but not directly. A bulb overhead cast a dim halo, flickering slightly as the wind howled outside. Neither spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, just suspended, like both were afraid words might shatter the moment. Claire watched the steam rise from her mug, the scent of chamomile mingling with dust and old wallpaper. Her sweater sleeves were pushed up, revealing faint red marks from earlier. She tucked her arms in, instinctively. Across from her, Nathaniel shifted in his chair. He didn't speak, but something about the way he looked at her had changed. Not pity, not apology, something quieter. Recognition? Maybe? They finished their tea without a single word, and in that shared silence, something between them began to thaw. By morning, the road would be cleared, but neither of them would return the same. Sometimes, silence says more than words ever could, and that night, their silence spoke volumes. The wind had quieted some, but rain still traced slow, cold fingers down the old kitchen windows. The storm outside had settled into a soft, persistent drizzle, like a lullaby no one quite knew the words to. The house creaked gently, as old places do, settling its bones while 2 strangers sat at a wooden table, sharing tea and the weight of years not yet spoken aloud. Claire cradled her mug between both hands, her fingers still chilled despite the tea's warmth. She stared at the rising steam, letting it blur the worn floral patterns on the cup. Across from her, Nathaniel sat motionless, his posture less rigid than usual. His tie had been loosened, his sleeves rolled just above the wrist, still formal, but something in him had softened. It was Claire who broke the silence first, her voice quiet but even. "My daughter's name is Emily." Nathaniel didn't look surprised. He only nodded, waiting. She's 7. She has this habit of drawing foxes on everything: napkins, envelopes, even receipts I forget in my purse. Claire smiled faintly. Last week, she drew one with glasses and a briefcase. Said it was going to a very important meeting. He chuckled under his breath, barely audible, but real. Claire looked down into her mug. Her dad left when she was 2. Said he didn't sign up for all the responsibility. I guess. I've just been trying to make sure she never feels that again. Nathaniel leaned back slightly, not out of disinterest, but as though giving her space to speak. My mom moved in last year. Early stage dementia. Some days she remembers what day it is. Some days she thinks I'm still in college. Claire gave a small shrug. We do our best. Emily reads to her in the evenings. It helps. There was a pause, not awkward, just full. Then Nathaniel spoke, his voice rougher than usual. My mother ran this company, not on paper, but in every way that counted. She was sharp, always in control. She believed emotions were distractions. Claire didn't interrupt. She never remarried. My father died young. I think she poured everything into the business and into raising me to take it all seriously. Claire tilted her head. And did you? A ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Too much. Probably. The kettle let out a soft hiss, long since removed from the stove, but still warm. Nathaniel refilled their cups without asking, his movements slow, deliberate. She passed 2 years ago. Stroke. I was in Tokyo on business when it happened. He stared at the rim of his mug. Didn't make it back in time. Claire didn't offer condolences. Instead, she said, gently, you still set her photo on your desk every Monday morning. He looked up, startled. You notice that I notice quiet things. He didn't respond, but something in his gaze shifted again, less guarded now. More human. The power flickered just after 10. First a pop, then a slow fading of light until the room sank into a soft gray silence. The only illumination came from the storm outside. Moonlight filtered through rain. Claire stood, brushing imaginary crumbs from her lap. I think there were candles in the hallway. Nathaniel found them first, tall white sticks in a chipped ceramic holder shaped like a lighthouse. He lit one, then another, placing them carefully on the table. Their flames danced in uneven circles across the walls, casting long shadows behind the chairs. Claire rubbed her arms, the chill creeping in deeper now. These old houses are beautiful, she whispered. But they weren't built for insulation. Without a word. Nathaniel stepped into the hallway and returned moments later with a soft gray scarf cashmere. Not wool. He handed it to her wordlessly. She hesitated, then draped it over her shoulders. Thank you. A silence settled between them again. But this one was different. Not heavy, not strained, just still. They sat there like that. 2 people with too much past and not enough present, holding their stories in pieces. On the far shelf beside the table was a small collection of old books, worn spines, pages curled at the edges. Claire reached for one, but as her fingers touched the leather cover, Nathaniel reached too. Their hands brushed, not dramatically, not like in the movies, just briefly skin against skin, warm and sudden. Neither pulled away immediately. Claire looked down. Nathaniel looked at her. Neither said a word. There were 1,000 things that could have been spoken in that moment. About grief, about loneliness, about the ways people hurt each other without meaning to, but none of it was said. Instead, Claire opened the book slowly, smoothing the page with gentle hands. Nathaniel reached for the candle, angling it closer so they could both see. The book was a collection of old poems. They didn't read aloud, just turned the pages together, occasionally pausing on a line that caught the light in a certain way. It was nearly midnight when Nathaniel finally stood. We should get some rest, he said. Claire nodded, but neither moved right away. When they finally rose, They walked to the stairs, side by side. He opened the door to her room and paused. "Good night, Claire." She looked at him. Really looked. "Good night, Nathaniel." He waited until she was inside before turning to go. But as Claire lay down, pulling the cotton blanket over her shoulders, her eyes wide open in the dark, she knew sleep wouldn't come easily, not because of the storm, but because for the first time in a long time, someone had seen her, and that was both comforting and terrifying. By morning, the road would be open, but what they left behind in that little kitchen would follow them longer than either of them expected. They returned to the office as if nothing had happened, but in places like this, whispers travel faster than facts. The next morning, the frost had lifted just enough to clear the roads. A light drizzle lingered, clinging to windows like fingerprints on glass. Claire sat quietly in the passenger seat as Nathaniel drove back toward the city. The silence between them was no longer strained, but it wasn't familiar either. It was the kind of silence that carried something unsaid, something too fragile to name. At the office, the automatic doors sighed open with their usual mechanical indifference. Fluorescent lights buzzed above. Phones rang softly in the background. The same receptionist greeted them with the same practiced smile. But Claire felt it the subtle change in air, as if the walls had learned something during her absence, as if the floors remembered every footstep. Nathaniel nodded once, curt and composed, then disappeared behind the glass door to his office. Claire followed suit, returning to her desk, logging into her system, organizing her inbox. Just like any other Thursday, except it wasn't. The first glance came from Susan in payroll. Quick, then quickly withdrawn. The second from Derek in legal, his brows raised slightly before he turned back to his screen. The third didn't bother hiding it, a long, lingering stare from Grace in marketing, followed by a whisper too hushed to catch, but loud enough to sting. Claire didn't flinch. She kept typing, kept filing, kept answering emails with practiced grace. But inside, her stomach twisted slowly, deliberately. Not because she had done something wrong, but because people had started to believe that she had. That afternoon, she passed 2 junior assistants in the hallway who suddenly fell silent when she approached. One of them blushed, the other smirked. Claire didn't acknowledge them, but her steps quickened. She made a note to avoid the break room for the rest of the week. By Friday, it was clear the storm had arrived, but this time, it wasn't weather, it was whispers. It was speculation disguised as curiosity, concern cloaking judgment. She heard her name once in the copy room, again near the elevators. The words were never full sentences, but the meaning was unmistakable. The CEO's secretary, overnight trip. Only one room. Claire tried to stay invisible again. She kept her voice measured, her posture poised. She responded to Nathaniel's requests with the same calm precision she always had. But every now and then, their eyes would meet across the hallway, over the top of a folder, and the quiet in those moments said more than the noise around them ever could. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. And that was enough to make people uncomfortable. Judith Cranford, the head of human resources, was not a woman who missed details. She had worked at Winters and Harrow since its founding, long before Nathaniel had taken the reins. Sharp-eyed, always in muted tones, Judith walked the halls like a principal patrolling her school, tolerant of competence, intolerant of ambiguity. She had never particularly liked Claire. Maybe it was her quiet strength. Maybe it was her resilience. Maybe it was the way she didn't seek approval, but still managed to earn respect. Or maybe it was something simpler. Maybe Judith had always believed that people like Claire's single mothers, with too much history and not enough pedigree, didn't belong in roles close to power. And now, with rumors thickening like fog, Judith had found her reason. On Monday morning, Claire received an internal memo requesting her presence in conference room 3B at 3:00 p.m. sharp. No subject line, no agenda, just a time, and her name. Claire stared at the email for a long time before closing it. The day passed slowly, thick with tension. Each passing hour felt like a step closer to something inevitable. By the time the clock hit 2:50, Claire's palms were damp despite the cool air. She made her way down the corridor, heels tapping softly against the tile floor. Outside the conference room, the blinds were already drawn. A small knot tightened in her chest. Inside, Judith sat alone at the head of the table. Her hands were folded, her smile tight. "Please, have a seat," she said. Claire did. The meeting lasted no more than 15 minutes. No accusations were made, no direct questions asked. Just routine clarification about conduct policies, and a gentle reminder about professionalism in out-of-office situations. Claire answered with poise, every word precise, each breath steady. But she knew what this was. It wasn't about professionalism. It was about perception. And perception, once twisted, was nearly impossible to untangle. That evening, Claire drove home in silence. The sky had turned a burnt orange by the time she pulled into the driveway. The porch light was already glowing, casting soft shadows on the welcome mat. Inside, Emily sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons and paper. "Hi, Mommy," she chirped. "I drew something for you." Claire slipped off her shoes, setting her purse aside before kneeling down. Emily held up the paper proudly. It showed two stick figures, one with long brown hair, the other taller, with gray streaks above the ears. Both were seated at a small table, holding teacups. The sun was shining behind them, and little hearts floated above the steam. "That's you and the nice man," Emily explained. "The one who gave you the blanket." Claire stared at the picture for a long time. She didn't correct her daughter. She didn't ask how she knew. She only smiled softly and pulled Emily into a gentle hug. "Thank you." "Peanut," she whispered. "It's beautiful." But her mind was already elsewhere, because tomorrow, the rumors would grow louder, and she would have to decide how much silence she could still carry. Sometimes the things people don't say are more dangerous than the ones they do, and Claire was starting to wonder if silence would be her shield or her undoing. She walked away without a word, but her daughter, she had plenty to say. The meeting was never called disciplinary, but everyone knew what it was. Claire entered the room with her shoulders square and her expression still, though Nathaniel noticed the tremor in her fingertips as she closed the door behind her. Judith was already seated, a file neatly opened, a notepad beside her hand, ready to document whatever she needed to turn perception into paperwork. There were no accusations, not direct ones, just concerns, just questions, just enough implication to stain a name without ever naming guilt. Nathaniel stood near the window, arms folded tightly across his chest. He hadn't seen it coming, hadn't realized how quickly quiet looks and long silences could become evidence in the eyes of others, and he hadn't known what to say to stop it, so he said nothing. Judith led the conversation with professional detachment, her voice level, her words dressed in HR polish. "Claire, while there's no formal complaint, it's our responsibility to ensure all staff relationships remain strictly professional, especially where there may be perceived imbalance of power." Claire didn't flinch. "Are you accusing me of misconduct?" "No, of course not," Judith replied, with a tight smile. "We're simply following up on concerns raised by several departments. For transparency." Nathaniel felt her eyes flick to him. Brief, sharp, a warning. Claire turned toward him then. For the first time during the meeting, their eyes met. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He could have said something. Should have. That the rumors were ungrounded. That Claire was competent, respectful, professional. That her integrity was not in question. But in the stillness of that room, weighed down by policy and perception, Nathaniel froze. Claire blinked once, slowly, as if bracing herself against a final gust of cold. "I'll save you the trouble," she said, standing. "I'll tender my resignation by the end of the day." "Claire," he started, but she was already walking away. Quiet, controlled, unshaken on the outside, but Nathaniel saw the pain in the angle of her jaw, the way her hand tightened around the strap of her bag. She never looked back that night. She didn't speak much at dinner. Emily noticed, of course. Children always do. Mommy, did someone make you sad? Claire smiled faintly and shook her head. No, peanut. Just a long day. But after Emily went to bed, Claire sat alone at the kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, staring at the resignation email she'd drafted on her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the send button for nearly an hour before she finally pressed it. Upstairs, Emily was still awake. She wasn't sleepy. Not really. Instead, she got out a sheet of paper, her favorite purple crayon, and the envelope she had borrowed from her grandmother's drawer. Her handwriting was uneven, and some words were spelled wrong, but the message was clear in the way only a child could write. Dear Mr. Harrow, Mommy says you're not a bad man. You just forgot how to be kind. She works very hard and still smiles when she's tired. That means she's brave. I think you should be kind again. Please don't make her sad. Love, Emily. I'm 7. She folded the paper 3 times, tucked it carefully into the envelope, and wrote Mr. Harrow in all capital letters. Then she slipped it into her backpack, planning to drop it in the school mailbox tomorrow. No one would notice. 3 days passed. The office felt quieter than usual. Claire's desk was empty, her things already packed, her inbox deactivated. The chair remained tucked in, unused, as if waiting for someone who'd only stepped away for a moment. But Nathaniel knew better. The silence pressed on him like the weight of unsent words. He hadn't expected her resignation to hit so hard, but each morning without her felt like a hollow note. Everything was still functional, still orderly, but nothing quite settled. He didn't tell anyone how often he stared at the mug she used to place on his desk, or how many times he reached for a file only to realize she wasn't there to hand it to him. His house felt emptier too. He hadn't noticed how loud the quiet could be until now. On Thursday, a small white envelope arrived in the morning mail plane. No return address, no stamp, just his name in block letters across the front. At first, he thought it was some misplaced internal memo, but when he opened it and pulled out the folded sheet of lined paper, he paused. Purple crayon, uneven letters. A child's heart poured across every crooked line. Mommy says you're not a bad man. You just forgot how to be kind. He read it once, then again. The words blurred. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered the paper to his lap. He hadn't cried at his mother's funeral. Hadn't cried when the deal fell through in Berlin. Hadn't cried since he was 13 and watched his father's casket lower into the ground. But now, here, in the quiet of his office, holding a child's letter written into faith and frustration, Nathaniel Harrow felt something break open inside him. The kind of break that lets light in. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, one hand covering his eyes as his shoulders shook. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. The letter remained on the desk all day. He didn't file it away, didn't lock it in a drawer. It lay there unguarded and fragile like a truth that couldn't be ignored anymore. And as the sun sank behind the skyline that evening, casting long shadows across the polished wood, Nathaniel made a decision. This wasn't how her story at Winters and Harrow would end, not if he had anything to say about it. Because sometimes, the clearest truths come not from boardrooms or briefings, but from the handwritten faith of a child who believes broken people can still be good. He had power, wealth, and a reputation to protect, but somehow, a child's handwritten note had undone him more than any business deal ever could. Nathaniel Harrow hadn't slept properly in days. Not the kind of sleeplessness that came from deadlines or global markets those he was used to. He knew how to manage crisis reports and late-night board calls. But this was something else. The letter lay on his nightstand now, right where he'd placed it after reading it for the 5th time. The purple crayon had faded slightly under the soft yellow lamplight. The last line still lingered in his mind like a song that refused to leave. Mommy says, you're not a bad man. You just forgot how to be kind. He folded the note once more and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he reached for his car keys and walked out into the morning chill. Claire Bennett lived in a modest brick home on the east side of town, a quiet street where driveways were short and mailboxes leaned slightly forward from years of winter frost. Her porch had a cracked wooden step and a row of potted plants struggling to hold on to summer's last blooms. Nathaniel stood there for a long moment before knocking, not because he was nervous, but because for the first time in a very long while, he didn't know what he was about to say. The door opened slightly. Claire stood there, eyebrows raised, her expression unreadable. She didn't invite him in. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry to come unannounced. I wanted to talk." She blinked. "This isn't the office. Mr. Harrow." "I know." Silence stretched between them, heavy and hesitant. Then, from inside the house, a warm voice called out Claire. "Who's at the door?" "Dear." An older woman appeared in the hallway, her hair pinned neatly back, a soft blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes lit up at the sight of him. Even if recognition didn't fully settle in, "Oh," she smiled. "Do come in. It's too cold to leave anyone standing outside." Claire hesitated just a beat before stepping aside. Nathaniel entered quietly, his shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The space was small but inviting, lived in, cozy in the way that money couldn't replicate. The scent of cinnamon and something faintly floral hung in the air. Emily peeked out from behind the living room couch, wide-eyed. "Hi," she said. Nathaniel gave a nod. "Hello, Emily." Claire motioned toward the kitchen. "We'll talk here." He followed her into the small room. The table was cluttered with coloring books, unpaid bills, and a ceramic teapot with a chipped lid. She cleared a space with practiced hands, wiping away crumbs with the corner of her sleeve. She didn't offer him tea, but she did sit down. He remained standing for a moment, then slowly lowered himself into the chair across from her. The silence returned, thick and unhurried. "I wasn't expecting you," she said finally. "I wasn't expecting to come." His voice was low, almost uncertain, but I couldn't stop thinking about that letter. Claire's gaze didn't soften. She shouldn't have sent it. She shouldn't have had to. He replied. Another pause. A long one. Nathaniel glanced around the kitchen at the chipped tile, the mismatched cups drying in the rack, the school calendar pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a duck. "This place," he said quietly, "feels more real than anything in my house." Claire tilted her head. "Because it has bills and fingerprints." He smiled just barely. "Because it has warmth." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are you here?" "Nathaniel." He opened his mouth, then closed it. He'd prepared words in the car, carefully structured lines about misunderstanding and misplaced silence. He'd rehearsed an apology that sounded just formal enough to keep distance intact, but none of it made sense now. He looked down at his hands still calloused from rowing, still steady from years of contracts and control, and said nothing. Claire studied him. Her face was calm, but not cold. She wasn't angry. She was tired. He saw it now, not just in her posture, but in the quiet strength she wore like armor. She wasn't someone who broke easily, but she was someone who had been asked to carry far more than she should have, and he had added to that weight. Just then, Emily stepped into the kitchen, holding a small plate. She placed it gently in front of Nathaniel. "Here," she said. "You look like someone who needs a cookie." There was a chocolate chip cookie, slightly misshapen, and a tiny ceramic cup of milk. Nathaniel stared at it, then looked up at the child's face, expectant, gentle, unafraid. A breath escaped him, and then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he laughed, not loud, not showy, just a quiet, breathy sound that softened his shoulders and loosened something behind his ribs. "Thank you," he said. Emily beamed, then ran back to the living room. Claire didn't smile, but her gaze lingered on him a beat longer than it had earlier. "You still didn't answer," she said. "Why are you here?" He looked at her, then really looked, and though the words weren't there yet, something in his eyes began to explain. Because sometimes the first step toward healing isn't an apology, it's just showing up and staying long enough to mean it. There are two kinds of apologies: the loud, public ones, and the ones whispered across a kitchen table, with no one to hear but the wind outside. The rain had slowed into a faint tapping against the window, like fingers too polite to knock. The tea kettle let out a soft sigh from the stove, not boiling, just breathing. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, eyes trained on the thin line of steam curling toward the ceiling. Across from her, Nathaniel sat with his fingers intertwined, thumbs nervously rubbing against each other, as if trying to coax the words out. He had never been good at apologies. He had delivered shareholder regrets, issued corporate statements, even recited legal disclaimers, but never anything like this. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice barely louder than the wind outside. "Not just about the meeting, not just about the contract, about you." Claire didn't move. Her eyes stayed on her tea. "I didn't see you," he continued. "Not really. I saw a role, a title, a name in an email chain, but not the woman behind all of that, not the strength, not the care, not the hours after work and the hours before sunrise." Still, she didn't speak. Nathaniel let out a shaky breath. "And that day, when Judith pulled you into that room, I should have said something, anything, at last." Claire looked up. Her eyes weren't angry, just tired. "I didn't need you to save me," she said quietly. "I just wanted to be seen." Her words landed with more weight than he expected. Not sharp, not cruel, just true. There was a stillness that followed, deep and honest. No rushing to fill the silence. No nervous gestures. Just two people sitting in the space between past mistakes and the possibility of forgiveness. From the hallway, soft footsteps padded toward them. Mrs. Bennett appeared in the doorway, her blanket now draped over her shoulders like a shawl. Her eyes, still bright despite the fog of age, moved between the two of them. "I was 22, she said, with a small smile, "when my husband told me no one would ever take me seriously if I raised my voice." Nathaniel looked startled. Claire glanced toward her mother, confused but curious. "Mrs. Bennett eased herself into a chair near the window. He wasn't cruel, not really, just raised in a world where women were meant to nod and keep the kettle full. I nodded a lot in those early years." She reached for a half-finished scarf in her knitting basket. Her hands, though slower now, moved with muscle memory born from decades. "One day," she continued, "I stopped nodding. He didn't understand it, but he learned to listen. Eventually," she looked directly at Nathaniel, "the world isn't built for women like Claire. It should be, but it isn't. Not yet." Nathaniel's throat tightened. He couldn't find words big enough for that truth. So, he nodded instead genuinely. Claire reached for the kettle and poured more tea. The scent of chamomile drifted between them, like a memory too old to name. The sound of the rain faded now, replaced by the occasional creak of the house settling, the distant ticking of a wall clock, and the soft rustle of yarn between Mrs. Bennett's fingers. Then came the sound of little feet running into the kitchen. Emily, cheeks flushed from play, carried a picture book cradled in her arms. "Mr. Harrow?" she asked, standing beside him. He turned. "Yes, can you read this to me?" He blinked. "You want me to read it?" She nodded seriously. "Mommy says your voice is very good for stories." Claire looked surprised. She hadn't said that, but she didn't interrupt. Nathaniel hesitated, then took the book with a careful grip. It was well worn at the edges, the corners softened by many small hands. The title was simple: The Quietest Bear. Emily crawled onto the chair beside him, scooting until her shoulder touched his arm. She opened the book to the first page and looked up expectantly. He began to read. At first, his voice was steady, formal, like delivering quarterly earnings. But soon, it shifted. He slowed down, softened. He lingered on the commas, honored the pauses. He gave the bear a low, thoughtful tone, and the birds light, curious ones. Claire watched from across the table, chin resting in her palm. Midway through the story, Emily leaned against him, her head gently resting on his shoulder. Nathaniel froze, not from discomfort, but something else, something that reached beneath his polished exterior and touched the part of him that had forgotten how it felt to be leaned on, trusted. He didn't move, just kept reading. By the final page, Emily's breathing had slowed. Her thumb rested in the corner of her mouth, her other hand loosely gripping the hem of his sleeve. Nathaniel closed the book gently. He didn't say anything. Claire stood quietly, then turned off the kettle. She didn't speak either. She walked to the doorway between the kitchen and living room, watching the two of them from the shadows, and something shifted in her. Not forgiveness, not fully, but the beginning of it. A softening, a pause in the ache, a question answered not by words, but by presence. She didn't wipe her eyes, didn't clear her throat. She just stood there for a moment longer. Then, quietly, she nodded. Because sometimes the smallest gestures, tea, a story, a child's head on a shoulder, are the beginnings of something whole. She didn't want her old job back. What she wanted was a life built on meaning, not fear. The morning was quiet when Claire opened her front door. The air was crisp, and a gentle mist hung low over the ground, like breath that hadn't quite settled. She stood for a moment on the porch, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, letting the silence gather around her. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Nathaniel, short, direct. "Would you consider coming back?" Claire stared at the screen, not with anger or resentment, but with something steadier. She didn't reply right away. They met at a small cafe near the river 2 days later. No assistants, no notepads, just the two of them, sitting across from one another as strangers who had begun to understand the shape of each other's silence. "I want you back," Nathaniel said, without preamble. "As executive secretary, your desk is still empty." Claire stirred her tea slowly, watching the swirl of milk disappear into the amber liquid. She let the spoon rest against the rim before lifting her gaze. "I appreciate the offer," she said calmly, "but I'm not coming back." Nathaniel blinked, surprised. "Is it because of what happened? Because of Judith? It's because I've changed," she said, "because I've been invisible for too long, because I don't want to fit into someone else's shape anymore." He sat back, quiet now, uncertain. Claire reached into her purse and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a proposal typed, edited, printed on recycled paper. The cover page read, "The Bennett Fund, a scholarship foundation for single mothers." "I want to create something," she said, "something that lifts women who've had to fight their way through school, through work, through life without a safety net. Something I never had." Nathaniel turned the pages slowly, eyes scanning each paragraph, each carefully constructed line. She had included projections, testimonials, even a timeline. "You wrote all this?" She nodded, at night. While Emily slept, he looked up. "You'd be incredible at this." She smiled, not shyly, not humbly, but with quiet certainty. "I know." He folded the proposal and placed it gently back on the table. "I'd like to fund it," he said. Claire's eyebrows lifted, surprised. "With no conditions," he added, "no branding, no press release, no influence, just let me be part of something good, without needing my name on it." Claire studied him. This wasn't the man who once humiliated her in a boardroom. This was someone else, someone learning to be kind again. After a long pause, she nodded. "Then we have a deal." But not everyone shared the sentiment. At the next company meeting, when Nathaniel presented the idea of Claire returning not as a secretary, but as head of an independent foundation partnered with the firm, the tension was immediate. Judith Cranford adjusted her glasses, her expression sharpening like frost on glass. "With all due respect," Mr. Harrow, I don't see how this benefits the company. Are we a charity now? Claire was standing at the back of the room. She had chosen not to sit at the table, not because she didn't belong there, but because she was choosing when and how she would speak. Nathaniel didn't answer Judith directly. He looked to Claire. She stepped forward. Her heels clicked softly on the floor as she reached the front of the room. The air shifted slightly tight with curiosity, skepticism, maybe even admiration. Claire looked around the room. She saw the faces that once avoided her gaze, the colleagues who whispered, the assistants who had never asked her name, all of them watching now. "I'm not here asking for sympathy," she said, her voice even and calm. "I'm not here to correct rumors or rehash the past. I'm here because I believe in something more important than comfort." She let the silence linger before continuing. "I don't want pity. I want purpose." Her words landed with the weight of lived truth. "I've made copies, I've scheduled meetings, I've picked up dry cleaning and kept secrets and stayed late long after the lights went out. But I've also raised a child, cared for an aging parent, and built a vision from scratch at a kitchen table with no help but my own determination." Judith folded her arms. "That doesn't mean it should come from the company's budget." "It's not coming from the budget," Nathaniel interrupted quietly. "It's coming from me." That silenced the room. Claire looked directly at Judith, then not with hostility, but with clarity. "I'm not here to be accepted," she said. "I'm here to offer something better than what I was once given. And whether this room supports it or not, it's already begun." For a moment, no one moved. Then Derek from legal nodded once. Susan in payroll lowered her eyes, then raised them again this time with something softer behind them. Even Grace, who had once smirked in the hallway, offered the smallest of nods. Claire didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had said what she came to say. As she stepped out into the hallway afterward, her heart beat steady, not fast. There were no tremors in her hands, no flutters in her chest. She had stood her ground, not as someone trying to return to a desk, but as someone walking forward into her own vision. Near the elevator, she paused. Several colleagues passed her, people she barely knew by name, and yet, one by one, they looked her in the eye, not with pity, not with doubt, with respect. She walked outside. The sun was beginning to break through the overcast sky, casting gold across the sidewalk. Nathaniel was waiting at the curb, hands in his pockets. "I told the board you'd make them uncomfortable," he said as she approached. "Uncomfortable's a good start," she replied. He smiled genuine, without weight. "What now?" he asked. Claire turned to look at the building behind her one last time. "Now," she said, "we build something that actually matters. Because healing doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it means going forward on your own terms." She had never imagined standing on a stage, but sometimes the quiet ones are the ones worth listening to the most. The ceremony was held in the town's old community hall, a place where floorboards creaked with stories and folding chairs had seen generations of birthdays, recitals, and farewells. The walls were painted a soft, fading blue, and paper lanterns swung gently from the ceiling, catching the late afternoon light. Claire sat backstage, her hands resting in her lap. She wore a simple navy blue dress, slightly faded but elegant in its own right. The fabric carried a story stitched by her mother's hands years ago, when money was tight but hope was plentiful. The seams weren't perfect, but the care was visible in every thread. Emily had helped zip it up that morning, standing on tiptoes to smooth the shoulders. "You look like a queen, Mommy," she had said with wide, sparkling eyes. Claire had smiled, kissed her daughter's forehead, and whispered, "Then you must be the crown I wear." Now, as the sound of applause rose from the auditorium, Claire stood, smoothing the front of her dress with a steadying breath. A volunteer opened the curtain slightly and nodded. "You're up." The lights were warm as she stepped onto the stage, not blinding, but soft like sunrise. Her heels echoed against the hardwood floor. The podium felt taller than she remembered. Her heart beat not with nerves, but with reverence. in the front row. Emily sat upright, her hands folded in her lap, eyes wide with admiration. Beside her, Mrs. Bennett leaned forward just slightly, both hands clasped around her cane, her eyes wet but smiling. And just a few rows back, almost in the shadows, sat Nathaniel. His suit was dark, his tie slightly loosened. He wasn't here as a CEO or as a man trying to prove something. He was here as a witness, as someone who had once overlooked her and now couldn't look away. Claire looked out over the crowd faces from the community, colleagues, strangers, students, mothers, elders, so many lives, each carrying their own quiet weight. She leaned toward the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering. "I don't usually speak to crowds," she began. "I come from quiet places, dinner tables with one chair empty, waiting rooms filled with worry, hallways where people don't look you in the eye if you're not wearing the right shoes." A hush fell over the room, not from silence, but attention, the kind that leans in. I was never the loudest, never the first to raise my hand. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be standing on a stage, but maybe that's exactly why I'm here. She paused. I used to think strength was about pretending, keeping your head down, smiling even when you wanted to cry, carrying everything so well that no one knew you were breaking. She let the silence stretch gently, allowing the words to settle. But I've learned that real strength isn't about hiding. It's about being seen and still choosing to stand. She looked toward her mother then. I watched a woman care for others her whole life and never once ask for recognition. I thought that was normal. I thought that's how women survived. Then she turned to Emily. But I don't want that for my daughter. I want her to live in a world where she doesn't have to earn her worth in silence. Claire straightened slightly, lifting her chin. So, this isn't a second chance. This isn't redemption. This is the first time. I'm truly being seen. There was a pause, long and breathless, and then applause. It began slowly, respectfully, then grew row by row into a standing ovation, the kind that didn't erupt, but rose like a tide, quiet at first, then undeniable. Even Judith Cranford stood, her arms still crossed, but her head nodding once almost imperceptibly. On stage, Claire did not cry, not because she wasn't moved, but because the moment had filled her with something larger than tears, wholeness, dignity, peace. She stepped back from the microphone and for a moment simply stood there, taking it all in. From the back of the room, Nathaniel remained standing after the applause faded. His hand moved slowly to his chest, an old habit his mother once taught him when words didn't come easily. He touched his heart and nodded. Claire met his eyes, and in that quiet exchange, nothing said. Everything heard, there was closure, or perhaps beginning. After the ceremony, people surrounded her, offering handshakes, congratulations, words like inspired and brave and thank you. Claire received them with grace, but her eyes kept drifting to the two figures waiting patiently by the exit. Emily ran to her first, arms flung wide. "Mommy, you were amazing, Mrs." Bennett held her hand as they walked together outside, the evening breeze carrying the scent of damp leaves and the soft trill of birds settling into trees. The three of them walked to the car slowly, the way people do when they don't want a good day to end too soon. Just as they reached the sidewalk, Nathaniel stepped forward. He didn't say much, just offered a simple envelope. Inside was a note, not typed, handwritten. "You didn't just change the company, you changed me." And Claire didn't reply right away. She just placed a hand on his arm briefly, softly. Then she turned, took Emily's hand, and walked on. Because sometimes recognition isn't about awards. It's about finally standing in the light you were meant for all along. It wasn't their first dinner together, but it was the first that didn't come with secrets, guilt, or fear. The restaurant sat quietly at the edge of Lake Wrentham, where the water stretched like polished glass beneath a slowly darkening sky. The air carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke, and every so often, A breeze whispered through the open windows, brushing the linen tablecloths with delicate fingers. Nathaniel had chosen the place not for its reputation, but for its quiet. There were no waiters in tuxedos, no background chatter of business talk or wine pairings, just candlelight, soft jazz, and the occasional clink of silverware against porcelain. Claire arrived with Emily, wearing a cardigan over her dress, her hair tucked loosely behind one ear. She didn't wear heels. She didn't need to. Nathaniel stood when they approached, not out of formality, but instinct. His tie was gone, his collar open. There was something softer in his eyes now, less calculation, more presence. "You found it?" he said. Claire smiled faintly. "We did." They were led to a small table by the window, where the lake shimmered in the last light of evening. A single candle flickered between them, its reflection dancing on the wine glasses like a quiet promise. Emily slid into her seat, wide-eyed at the folded napkin and tiny butter dish. "This place is fancy," she whispered. Claire chuckled. "Well, maybe just a little." The meal began slowly, salads with candied pecans, warm rolls wrapped in linen, glasses filled with sparkling water. There was no rush, no meetings to get back to, no spreadsheets waiting in a briefcase. Instead, there were small moments. Nathaniel asked about Emily's drawings. Claire shared a story about her mother, forgetting where she left her glasses only to find them in the freezer next to the peas. They laughed, not loudly, but enough to feel real. The waiter brought roasted chicken and pan-seared trout, the plates artfully simple. Between bites, Nathaniel glanced toward the lake. "I used to come here with my mother," he said, "not often, but when we did, she always insisted we order dessert first." Claire raised an eyebrow. Why she said sweet things shouldn't wait. You never know what the main course might bring. Claire smiled. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "She would have liked you," he said quietly. There was no weight in the silence that followed, only warmth. After the plates were cleared, and Emily was happily nibbling on a sugar cookie with her juice, Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. "I have something," he said, placing a slim envelope on the table. "For both of you." Claire hesitated, then slowly picked it up and slid the flap open. Inside were 3 travel tickets, handwritten itinerary, printed confirmations, all dated for late June, Boston, then Bar Harbor, then a coastal cottage in Maine. Claire looked up. "What is this, a summer trip?" Nathaniel said. "For you, for Emily, and, if you'll allow, for me?" Emily gasped, nearly knocking over her juice. "Are we going to the ocean?" Nathaniel smiled at her. "Only if your mom agrees." Claire turned the papers over slowly. "Processing. I'm not trying to impress you," he added. "And this isn't repayment. It's not a favor. It's just time. Time to breathe. Time to be somewhere that isn't heavy." She looked at him, then really looked. He wasn't performing. He wasn't asking anything in return. This wasn't business. It wasn't romance. It was something simpler. Something quieter. An offering. Claire placed the envelope on the table again, gently, then took a long sip of her tea. "We'll think about it," she said. It wasn't a no. It wasn't a yes. But her fingers remained on the envelope. Emily, meanwhile, had already begun dreaming out loud seashells, sandcastles, blueberry ice cream. Nathaniel leaned back slightly, watching her with something close to wonder. "She's fearless," he murmured. "She had to be," Claire replied. Then, without looking up, she reached across the table and placed her hand gently on the linen, close, but not quite touching his, just near enough that he could feel the warmth. It was a gesture without ceremony, no drama, no declaration, just presence. He didn't move his hand closer, didn't speak, but he stayed in that moment, still and grateful. Outside the window, the lake caught the first shimmer of starlight. The world felt hushed, like it was listening. In the distance, a loon called low and lonely, but beautiful. And inside, there were no more questions to answer, only the comfort of knowing no one was pretending anymore. Because the deepest connections are the ones you don't have to name. You just feel them like candlelight in the dark. Not every story ends with fireworks. Some end with a look, a hand held, and a silence that speaks 1,000 truths. The river ran quiet that afternoon. Winter had passed, but spring had not yet claimed everything. The trees were still bare, but their branches held the faint promise of buds. The breeze carried a gentler chill, now one that brushed the skin but didn't bite. Claire walked slowly along the gravel path beside the riverbank, her steps unhurried. Emily trotted ahead, stopping now and then to pick up smooth stones or point at birds skipping across the water. Beside Claire, Nathaniel matched her pace. No words were spoken, none were needed. There was something sacred about the silence between them now. It wasn't avoidance, it wasn't discomfort, it was fullness. A quiet so complete it hummed with everything they had already said with glances, gestures, presence. Claire wore her hair down, the wind lifting strands of it every few steps. She had on her favorite coat, the one with a frayed pocket that still smelled faintly of lavender and coffee. Nathaniel had rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that looked more used to carrying groceries than contracts. In his hand, he held a small paper bag with cookies Emily had insisted they buy from the corner bakery. They reached a small wooden bench facing the river. Claire sat first. Then, Nathaniel. Emily climbed up between them, swinging her legs back and forth above the grass. A bird called from across the water, high, clear, and distant. Claire turned her face toward the sound, her expression soft. There was a time, not long ago, when such quiet moments felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But now, they felt like the only currency that mattered. Nathaniel reached into the bag and handed Emily a cookie. She accepted it with both hands, took one bite, and leaned contentedly against his side without saying a word. He looked down at her, at the weight of her small head against his arm. Then, carefully, he turned toward Claire. "I forgot how to be kind," he said, his voice barely above the wind. "You reminded me." Claire didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him. Not surprised, not overwhelmed, just seen. He didn't elaborate. He didn't ask for forgiveness. The words had been enough. They didn't need to be more. Time passed slowly. A boat drifted in the distance, somewhere behind them. A wind chime rang faintly from a porch. Every sound felt placed with care, like part of a melody that only 3 people were allowed to hear. Claire reached for Emily's hand. The little girl looked up, cookie crumbs on her chin, and grinned. Then she extended her other hand toward Nathaniel. He looked down, startled, then smiled, and took it. So, there they were, 3 hands linked, warm and sure on a quiet bench by a quiet river. No declarations, no promises, just presence. The sun dipped slightly lower, casting golden ribbons across the water. Shadows stretched gently behind them, long and softened. The moment didn't demand anything. It simply was. Claire closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply. The scent of pine, of warm earth, of possibility. Behind her eyelids, she saw her past self typing late into the night, crying softly in locked bathrooms, folding laundry while holding back fear. That woman was still part of her, but she no longer carried the weight alone. Beside her sat a man who had once been the source of pain and now, unexpectedly, a companion in healing, not a hero, not a savior, just someone who had chosen to stay. Claire opened her eyes again and looked at Emily, whose eyes had begun to droop. "I think someone's ready for a nap," she whispered. Nathaniel chuckled softly. "Maybe we all are." They stood together, slowly, carefully not to wake the rhythm that had wrapped itself around them. As they walked back down the path, Claire on one side, Nathaniel on the other, and Emily between them, they didn't speak. Their footsteps made a soft crunch on the gravel. The river murmured beside them, always moving but never in a hurry. At one point, Claire looked over at Nathaniel. He was watching the water. "What are you thinking?" she asked gently. He didn't answer right away. Then, with a small smile, he replied, "That I used to think silence was something to fill. Now, it feels like something to keep." She nodded once. That was enough. They reached the parking lot as the first stars began to blink awake in the sky, the kind of stars you had to pause to see the quiet ones. Nathaniel opened the car door for them, then paused. Claire turned to him. Their eyes met. No fanfare, no script. Just the knowing that this story, whatever it became next, would be written without force. She reached out not to hug, not to cling, just to rest her hand briefly over his. A thank you. A truth. Then she turned, helped Emily into the car, and closed the door gently. Nathaniel stood there as the car pulled away, watching until the taillights turned the corner and disappeared. He didn't say anything, but his silence said everything. In a world that often rewards loud voices and quick judgments, this story reminds us of the quiet strength and dignity, patience and kindness. Claire didn't fight back with anger. She didn't demand attention. She simply showed up day after day with grace, even when no one was watching. And sometimes, that's the hardest kind of strength to hold. We all carry battles no one sees, whether it's caring for a loved one, dealing with quiet grief, or feeling overlooked in a noisy world. But this story shows that even the smallest acts of courage, like choosing not to give up, or offering kindness to someone who doesn't seem to deserve it, can lead to transformation. Not every apology needs words. Not every healing needs fanfare. Sometimes, the most powerful moments come in silence, in eye contact, in a hand gently held. It's never too late to be seen, and it's never too late to be the reason someone else remembers how to be kind. So, wherever you are in life, take heart. Your presence matters more than you know. Thank you for spending your time with us and allowing this story to touch your heart. If it moved you in any way, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength or the kindness you've once offered, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to Shining Stories for more heartfelt journeys. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter. We'll see you in the next one.